Princess Valara Kethari stood at the edge of the Imperial docking platform and watched the human shuttle descend through the purple clouds of her homeworld. And she felt nothing but disappointment growing inside her chest like a cold stone. She had made her requests very clear to the Galactic Council, and she had written 17 formal letters demanding a proper escort for the most dangerous diplomatic mission in 300 years. And in every single letter she had asked for the same thing: a Vexian warrior with combat implants and neural reaction boosters, a Korathi sentinel with cybernetic armor grafted directly onto its skeleton. Even a Thelian mind guard would have been acceptable. With their ability to sense hostile thoughts from 100 meters away, what she got instead was a human. The shuttle touched down with a soft hiss of landing thrusters, and the ramp lowered slowly. And Princess Valara crossed her four-fingered hands over her chest and prepared herself to be insulted. The man who walked down the ramp was neither tall nor short by human standards, which meant he barely reached the shoulder of most Solmari nobles. And his armor was simple gray tactical plating without any visible weapon systems or enhancement modifications. And he carried nothing but a standard sidearm at his hip and a small travel bag over his shoulder. His hair was dark brown and cut short in a practical style, and his eyes were an unremarkable shade of brown. And his face was the kind of face that would disappear in any crowd on any world in the galaxy. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked around at the gleaming spires of the Solmari capital city. And then he looked at Princess Valara, and he offered a polite nod that contained no fear and no excitement and no particular emotion at all. "Ambassador Cole Bennett," he said, and his voice was calm and steady. "Earth Unified Command, assigned to your protection detail." Valara turned to Counselor Dreth, her father's oldest and most trusted advisor, and she did not bother to lower her voice because she wanted the human to hear every word. "This is an insult," she said, and her silver skin began to shimmer with irritation, and the bioluminescent patterns along her cheekbones flared bright blue the way they always did when she was angry. "The Galactic Council sends me a human for the summit at Throne World Vithos, and you expect me to accept this without complaint." Counselor Dreth was old and wise, and he had survived 40 years of imperial politics. But even he looked uncomfortable as he tried to find the right words. "Your Highness," the humans were very insistent, "and Ambassador Bennett comes with the highest recommendations from Earth's Unified Command, and his record shows 17 successful protection assignments without a single what? Without a single what?" Valara interrupted, and her voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. "Without a single impressive moment, without a single display of actual capability, without a single reason for me to believe he can protect me from Kethrani assassins who have killed 14 diplomatic escorts in the past 10 years alone." She gestured toward Cole Bennett with one hand, and she did not care that he was watching her with those calm brown eyes that showed no reaction to her words. "Look at him, Counselor, and tell me what you see," she demanded. "No enhancement grafts in his muscles, no exoskeletal plating on his bones, no neural boosters in his brain. His species cannot even perceive ultraviolet light, and their hearing range is pathetically limited, and their physical strength is barely adequate for basic labor." Cole Bennett continued to stand at the bottom of the shuttle ramp, and he continued to watch her with that patient expression. And he did not interrupt or defend himself or show any sign that her words had affected him at all. "The Kethrani honor guards carry molecular disruptors that can reduce a body to atoms in less than a second." Valara continued, and she was speaking more to herself now than to Counselor Dreth. "Their assassins use neurotoxins that can kill a Solmari in 3 heartbeats. And their warriors are 3 meters tall with armored carapaces that can stop plasma fire." She took a breath and looked directly at the human. "And the Galactic Council expects you to protect me from all of that." Cole Bennett tilted, his head slightly to one side. And for just a moment, something flickered in his brown eyes. Something that Valara could not quite identify. Something that was not fear, and not anger, and not embarrassment. "I will try not to disappoint." "Your Highness," he said. Valara stared at him for a long moment. And she felt her frustration growing because she had expected him to argue, or to defend himself, or to make some kind of excuse. And instead, he just stood there with that calm patience that she was already beginning to hate. "Counselor Dreth," she said without looking away from the human, "I want a formal complaint filed with the Galactic Council before we leave orbit. And I want it made clear that the Solmari Empire does not accept this assignment. And I want alternative escorts requested from at least 5 different member species. Of course." "Your Highness," Counselor Dreth said with a small bow, "I will begin the paperwork immediately." Valara turned and began walking toward the transport that would take them to the diplomatic vessel. And she heard the soft footsteps of the human following behind her at a respectful distance. And she told herself that she would spend every moment of the 6-day journey to Throne World Vithos making sure that Earth's unified command understood exactly how inadequate their representative. Washer handmaiden Lissa fell into step beside her. And Lissa was young and curious, and she kept glancing back at the human with interest. "He seems very calm." "Your Highness," Lissa said quietly, "most beings become upset when you criticize them so directly. That is not calmness," Valara said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "That is emptiness. And there is a difference between a warrior who feels no fear and a fool who does not understand danger." Lissa nodded. But Valara could see that her handmaiden was not entirely convinced. And that irritated her even more. The transport left it off and carried them toward the Starlight Meridian, the diplomatic vessel that would take them across 3 sectors of space to the Kethrani Dominion's capital world. And Valara sat in her seat and stared out the window and tried to ignore the human sitting quietly in the corner 6 days. She told herself, and then the summit would begin. And then she would either succeed in forging an alliance with the most dangerous species in the galaxy, or she would die in a throne room surrounded by enemies, and her only protection was a human who carried no visible weapons and showed no visible skills and seemed to have no visible purpose. At all, she closed her eyes and wondered what she had done to deserve such a fate. 3 days into the voyage aboard the Starlight Meridian, Princess Valara had learned several things about her human escort, and every single one of them irritated her in ways she had not expected. The first thing she learned was that Cole Bennett was quiet, but not in the way that proper guardians were quiet, and not in the way that servants were quiet, and not in the way that soldiers were quiet. He was quiet in a way that felt almost like meditation, like he was always listening to something that no one else could hear. And he stood at doorways without fidgeting or shifting his weight. And he sat in corners without tapping his fingers or checking his equipment. And he moved through the ship like a ghost that had forgotten it was supposed to make noise. The second thing she learned was that he noticed everything. And this was the part that bothered her the most on the 2nd day of the journey. Valara had complained to Lissa about a flickering light panel in her quarters, and she had mentioned it only once in passing while they were walking through the corridor. And she had not expected anything to come of it because light panels were a low priority on diplomatic vessels. But when she returned to her quarters that evening, the light panel had been repaired, and when she asked Lissa who had reported the problem, Lissa had looked confused and said that she had not reported anything to anyone later that same night. Lissa mentioned offhand that the secondary corridor near the cargo bay felt drafty, and the next morning there was a maintenance crew sealing a faulty atmospheric regulator that they said had been flagged by a member of the diplomatic partner Valara never saw Cole Bennett speak to any of the crew members, and she never saw him use a communication device. And she never saw him do anything except stand quietly and watch. But somehow things kept getting fixed and problems kept getting solved, and she could not figure out how he was doing it. Third thing she learned was that he refused to be provoked. And this was the thing that made her want to scream with frustration on the fourth evening of the journey. She found him in the observation lounge, standing alone in front of the massive windows that looked out onto the streaming stars faster than light travel. And she decided that she would force him to react to something. "You understand what we are walking into," she said as she approached him. And her voice was sharp and direct. The Kathrani have killed 14 diplomatic escorts in the past decade. And those were trained warriors with combat implants and advanced weapons. And you have nothing but a sidearm and a calm expression. "Yes, Your Highness," he said without turning from the window. "Their honor guards carry molecular disruptors that can erase you from existence," she continued. And she moved closer so that she was standing beside him. "Their assassins use neurotoxins that work in seconds. And their warriors have killed beings 10 times more powerful than any human has ever been. I have read the briefings." "Your Highness." Valara felt her skin begin to shimmer with irritation, and the blue patterns on her cheeks flared brighter. "And you are not concerned?" she demanded. Cole turned from the window, and in the light of the streaming stars his plain features looked almost thoughtful, and his brown eyes met hers without flinching or looking away. "I know what we are walking into," he said simply. "Then why did you accept this assignment?" Valara asked. And she let all of her frustration pour into the question. Was it glory that you wanted, or credits? Or some human concept of adventure that I do not understand? For the first time since she had met him, something flickered across his expression. And it was not quite a smile, but it was close to one. And it made him look almost human in a way that surprised her. "My sister asked me the same thing," he said. Valara blinked, because she had not expected him to mention anything personal. And she had not expected him to have a sister. And she had not expected him to compare her to anyone at all. "And what did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her that someone needed to go," Cole said. And he shrugged his shoulders in a gesture that seemed very human and very strange. "And I figured I might as well be useful." Valara stared at him, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that was not quite respect, but was not quite contempt either. "Useful," she repeated, and her voice was flat with disbelief. "You think you can be useful against molecular disruptors and neurotoxins and 3-meter-tall warriors with armored shells? We will see." "Your Highness." She wanted to argue with him, and she wanted to make him understand how foolish his confidence was. And she wanted to shake him until he showed some kind of normal emotion like fear or doubt or anger. But he just stood there in the starlight with that patient expression. And he did not defend himself, and he did not explain himself. And he did not give her anything to argue against. "You are the strangest being I have ever met," she said finally. "I have heard that before." "Your Highness." Valara turned and walked out of the observation lounge. And she felt more frustrated than ever. But underneath the frustration, there was something else. Something that felt almost like curiosity. She had spent 3 days trying to understand this human. And she had learned that he was quiet and observant and impossible to provoke. But she still did not understand what he was actually capable of. Maybe he was exactly what he appeared to be. A simple human with no special abilities who had been assigned to her by a council that did not take her safety seriously. Or maybe there was something more. Something hidden beneath that calm exterior. Something that she was not supposed to see until the moment when it mattered most. She did not know which. Possibility frightened her more. That night she lay in her quarters and listened to the hum of the ship's engines. And she thought about the summit that waited for them at Throne World Phethus. And she thought about all the ways that everything could go wrong, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought about a human who had said that he wanted to be useful. And she wondered what that word meant to a species. that the rest of the galaxy had spent 60 years underestimating 3 more days until they reached the Kethrani Dominion 3 more days until she found out whether Cole Bennett was a fool or something else entirely. The Kethrani Dominion's capital world was the most terrifying place that Princess Valara had ever seen, and she had seen many terrifying places in her 200 years of life. The shuttle descended through clouds of ash and smoke, and below them stretched a landscape of eternal twilight, where massive obsidian spires rose from the ground like the claws of some ancient beast reaching toward the sky. And each spire was carved from top to bottom with the names of worlds that the Kethrani had conquered and species that they had destroyed. 3 dying suns hung in the sky, their light a sickly orange-red color that made everything look like it was covered in old blood. And Valara knew from her studies that each of those suns had once been the center of a thriving star system before the Kethrani had drained them for fuel. Beautiful in a terrible way. Cole Bennett said quietly from his seat beside her. Valara glanced at him with surprise, because it was rare for him to speak without being spoken the first. And she saw that he was looking out the window with an expression that was difficult to read. "You find beauty in this?" she asked. "I find truth in it," he said. And his brown eyes moved slowly across the landscape of obsidian and ash. The Kethrani do not hide what they are, and there is something almost honest about that. Valara considered his words and found that she could not argue with them, because he was right in a way that made her uncomfortable. And the Kethrani were monsters, but they were monsters who did not pretend to be anything else. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform that was carved from a single piece of black stone, and the platform was surrounded by statues of Kethrani warriors standing over the broken bodies of their enemies. And Valara took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was coming. She stepped off the shuttle with her head held high and her silver skin shimmering in the dim red light, and her ceremonial robes flowed behind her like liquid metal. And she looked every bit the princess that she was. Lissa followed behind her, carrying the diplomatic gifts that they had brought from the Solmari homeworld. And beside Valara walked Cole Bennett, looking as unremarkable as ever in his simple gray armor. The Kethrani honor guard that waited for them was everything that Valara had feared, and more 8 warriors stood in a line at the edge of the platform, and each one was over 3 meters tall, with segmented carapaces that gleamed like polished obsidian, and their bodies were covered with embedded weapon systems that glowed with barely contained energy, and their compound eyes reflected the dying light of the 3 suns in 1,000 fractured images. The leader of the honor guard stepped forward, and his mandibles clicked together in a sound that might have been speech or might have been a threat. "The Solmari princess," he rumbled in a voice like grinding stones. "We have been expecting you." His compound eyes moved from Valara to Cole and back again, and his mandibles spread wide in what might have been amusement, and her pet, yet dead Valara felt her skin flush with embarrassment and anger, and she opened her mouth to respond with something sharp and diplomatic. But before she could speak, Cole stepped forward. "Ambassador Bennett, actually," he said in a conversational tone that contained no fear and no anger and no acknowledgement that he was surrounded by beings who could tear him apart in seconds. "Earth Unified Command, official escort to Her Highness Princess Valara of the Solmari Empire." He looked around at the obsidian spires and the statues of conquest and the blood-red sky, and he nodded slightly. "Nice architecture you have got here," he said. "Very dramatic. I like what you have done with the dying suns. Really sets a mood." The honor guard's clicking intensified, and Valara could not tell if they were laughing or preparing to attack, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited to see what would happen next. "The summit begins tomorrow at the first eclipse," the lead warrior announced finally, and his voice was cold and hard. "You will be escorted to your quarters in the diplomatic wing, and you will remain there until you are summoned." He leaned closer to Cole. and his massive head blocked out the light of the nearest sun. "Do not wander," he said. "Do not speak to any Kethrani citizen, and do not make trouble." Little human. Cole looked up at the towering warrior with that same patient expression that Valara had come to know so well. And he smiled slightly. "Trouble is the last thing on my mind," he said. The honor guards stared at him for a long moment. And then they turned and began walking toward the nearest spire. And Valara and her small party followed behind them through streets that were empty and silent and watched by 1,000 hidden eyes. Their quarters were exactly what Valara had expected, which meant they were a deliberate insult designed to remind her of her place in the Kethrani hierarchy. 2 small rooms on the lowest level of the diplomatic wing, with narrow beds and minimal furnishings and surveillance devices hidden so poorly in the walls and ceiling that even Listen noticed them within seconds of entering. "They want us to know we are being watched," Valara said quietly. "They want us to feel small," Cole agreed. And he was examining the door mechanism with what appeared to be casual interest. And his fingers moved over the surface in a way that seemed almost unconscious. "What are you doing?" Valara asked. "Just looking," he said. And he tucked something small into his pocket. And Valara could not see what it was. He straightened and turned to face her. And in the dim light of the cramped quarters, his expression was unreadable. "Get some rest." "Your Highness," he said, "tomorrow is going to be a long day, and you will need all of your strength for what is coming." Valara wanted to ask him what he meant, and she wanted to demand that he explain himself. And she wanted to know what he had taken from the door, and why he seemed so calm when they were surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead, but something in his eyes stopped her. Something that was not quite confidence and not quite warning. Something that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff and looking down into darkness. "Cole," she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without his title. "Do you actually have a plan for what happens tomorrow?" He looked at her for a long moment. And then he smiled, and it was a real smile this time. Not the polite expression he usually wore. "I always have a plan." "Your Highness." He said that night Valara dreamed of obsidian spires crumbling into dust and 3 dying suns exploding into light. And she woke in the darkness of her small room with the feeling that something was about to change forever. Outside her window, the Kethrani capital city waited in silence. And somewhere in the shadows, things were moving that she could not see. The grand summit chamber of Throne World Vithos was designed to make every visitor feel like an insect, crawling across the floor of a god's temple. And Princess Valara had to admit that it succeeded perfectly. The vaulted ceilings rose so high that they disappeared into darkness overhead, and the walls were covered with carvings that depicted the Kethrani's greatest conquests in horrifying detail. And the air itself seemed to press down on everyone who entered like a physical weight, but it was the floor that made Valara's blood run cold. She had heard stories about the Throne of Bones, but she had always assumed they were exaggerations meant to frighten children and intimidate diplomats. They were not exaggerations. The floor of the summit chamber was polished black stone, smooth and gleaming like a mirror, and running through that stone were veins of crystal that pulsed with a faint inner light. And those veins were not natural formations. They were the remains of the Kethrani's enemies, political prisoners and failed diplomats and conquered royalty. All of them compressed and crystallized and embedded into the floor of the throne room, transformed into a gleaming mosaic of death that stretched from wall to wall. Valara walked across that floor and felt the weight of 1,000 dead souls beneath her feet. And she kept her head high and her expression calm, because she was a princess of the Somari Empire, and she would not show fear to anyone. Representatives from 37 worlds sat in tiered galleries around the edges of the chamber, watching her approach the central dais with expressions that ranged from curiosity to sympathy to barely hidden contempt at the far end of the chamber. Rising from a throne made of black metal and ancient bone, sat the Kethrani Emperor. He was massive, even by Kethrani standards, and his segmented carapace was studded with the crowns of kings and queens from 100 different worlds, and his 6 compound eyes tracked Valara's every movement with the patience of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. Princess Valara Kethari of the Solmari Empire, a herald announced in a booming voice, comes before the great emperor to seek alliance and friendship between our peoples. Valara stopped at the edge of the dais and bowed exactly as protocol demanded. Not too deep and not too shallow. And she began the speech that she had practiced 1,000 times. "Great Emperor of the Kethrani Dominion," she said, and her voice rang clear through the massive chamber. "I bring greetings from my father and from all the people of the Solmari Empire, and I come with offers of trade and partnership that will benefit both our nations." The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, and his mandibles clicked together in a sound like breaking bones. "The Solmari seek an alliance," he said, and his voice was like a funeral bell tolling in the darkness. "They offered trade routes through their territories and mining rights in their asteroid fields, and cultural exchange between our peoples." He paused, and his 6 eyes moved slowly across the chamber, taking in the representatives from 37 worlds who were watching with growing unease. "What they do not offer," the Emperor continued, and his voice dropped to a rumble that Valara felt in her bones, "is respect." Valara felt her hearts begin to beat faster, and she sensed movement at the edges of the chamber, and she knew with sudden terrible certainty that something had gone very wrong. "Great Emperor," she began, "the Solmari Empire has nothing but respect for." "You seek to manipulate us," the Emperor interrupted, and he rose from his throne, and his massive body cast a shadow across the entire dais that swallowed Valara in darkness. "You send your princes with gifts and pretty words, but we know the truth of what your father plans." The honor guards around the edges of the chamber stepped forward, and their weapons began to glow with energy. And in the galleries, the representatives from 37 worlds began to murmur with alarm. "Your father builds warships in secret," the Emperor declared. "Your scientists study our weaknesses and search for ways to poison our hive minds, and you think we do not know. But we know everything that happens in this galaxy." He pointed one massive claw at Cole Bennett, who stood quietly at the edge of the chamber with his hands at his sides. "And your escort," the Emperor said with contempt dripping from every word. "Your escort is an insult that we will not ignore, because you send the human to stand before us, a creature so weak and so fragile that we could crush him with a single thought." Valara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, she heard a sound behind her, and she turned to see a hidden door sliding open in the wall. And through that door came a death squad of Kethrani, assassins with weapons already charged and aimed at her heart. "The Kethrani do not negotiate with those who mock us," the Emperor proclaimed, and his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. "We teach them the price of arrogance, and that lesson will be written in blood and bone and crystal on this very floor." Valara looked at the assassins behind her, and the honor guards in front of her, and the Emperor towering above her, and she understood that she was going to die in this throne room, surrounded by enemies. With her failure broadcast to every corner of the galaxy, there was nowhere to run, and no one to help her, and nothing she could do. Then Cole Bennett stepped in front of her. He moved without hurrying, without fear, without any sign that he understood the danger that surrounded them. And he placed himself between Valara and the assassins with his back straight and his hands still at his sides. "Your Highness," he said in that calm, steady voice that she had heard so many times before, "you might want to cover your eyes." The Kethrani Emperor would later describe what happened next as impossible, and the honor guards would call it an aberration of physics, and the representatives from 37 worlds would spend decades debating whether it was. Technology or biology or something else entirely, Cole. Then it reached into his jacket with one smooth motion and withdrew a small cylinder that was gray and unremarkable, and looked like nothing more dangerous than a tool for opening containers. What is that? The Emperor demanded. And for the first time, there was something other than contempt in his voice. What weapon do you think can save you from? Cole twisted the cylinder, and the world came apart. The device was called a graviton hammer, and it was human technology that had been developed in secret laboratories deep beneath the surface of Earth. And it had never been deployed in any conflict. And it had never been revealed to any alien species. And it did something that should not have been possible according to every law of physics that the galaxy understood. It created a localized gravitational pulse, roughly equivalent to the core of a small star. And it maintained that pulse for exactly 1/10 of 1 second. The effect on the throne room was catastrophic. The polished floor shattered, not cracked, not fractured, but shattered completely. And the crystallized remains of countless victims exploded, upward in a cloud of razor-sharp fragments that filled the air like a storm of glass and light. And the obsidian tiles fractured into spider web patterns that spread from Cole's position in every direction until they reached the walls. The honor guards were thrown backward, as if they had been swatted by a giant invisible hand, and their armored bodies slammed into the walls and left craters in the stone. And their weapons flew from their claws and spun away into the darkness. The assassins behind Valara were crushed against their own hidden doorway, and the metal frame buckled and twisted under sudden impossible weight. And they collapsed in heaps of broken carapace and twitching limbs, and Cole Bennett stood at the center of it all, completely unaffected by the forces that had devastated everything around him. With the cylinder glowing faintly in his hand and his expression as calm as it had ever been, the Emperor staggered on his throne, and his massive form struggled against forces that pulled at him from every direction. And for the first time in his long, terrible reign, he looked afraid. "What?" he gasped. And his voice was no longer a funeral bell, but the sound of something breaking. "What are you? What is that? How can you?" "I am an escort," Cole said simply. And he took a step forward across the shattered floor, and the crystal fragments crunched beneath his boots. "It is what I do." He twisted the cylinder again, and the gravitational effect reversed suddenly. The Kathrani warriors were floating, weightless and helpless, their armored bodies drifting through the air like leaves in a gentle wind. And their claws grasped at nothing, and their weapons were impossibly far away. And they could do nothing but watch as the human walked toward their emperor. The representatives in the galleries were screaming and running, and some of them were praying to gods they had not believed in for centuries. But Valara did not move, because she could not look away from what was happening. Cole stopped at the edge of the dais and looked up at the Emperor, who was floating above his own throne with his 6 eyes wide and his mandibles hanging open in shock. "Now," Cole said, and his voice was still conversational, still friendly, still the same voice he had used when discussing light panels and drafty corridors. "Here is what is going to happen." He held up the cylinder so that the Emperor could see it clearly. "Princess Valara is going to finish her diplomatic presentation, and you are going to listen politely, and you are going to agree to every reasonable term that she offers. And then we are all going to pretend that this never happened." The Emperor made a sound that might have been protest, but Cole continued as if he had not heard. "Because if we do not do that," he said, "then I'm going to find out what this thing does on a larger scale. And honestly, I am curious. Because our scientists told me it could crack a planet in half, but we never tested that. And I would hate to destroy such nice architecture." The chamber was silent, except for the soft sounds of floating Kathrani warriors struggling against weightlessness and the distant echoes of panicked representatives fleeing through corridors. Valar found her voice. though it took more effort than anything she had ever done. "Cole," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You just made a mess," he agreed without turning around. "I'm sorry about that. I will help with cleanup later." She looked at the destroyed floor, where 1,000 crystallized victims had been freed from their prison of stone. And she looked at the groaning honor guards who were slowly sliding down the walls. And she looked at the Emperor of the Kathrani Dominion suspended helplessly, 3 meters above his own throne, and then she looked at the small, unremarkable human who had just shattered the most powerful empire's sense of invincibility in less than 10 seconds. "You could have told me," she said. Cole finally turned to look at her, and he smiled, and it was a real smile, warm and almost playful. "Where's the fun in that?" he said. Valara stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised herself more than anything else that had happened in the throne room. She laughed. The Treaty of Vithas was signed 3 days later, and the Kathrani agreed to every Salmari demand plus several concessions they had never offered to any species before. The Emperor personally apologized for his hasty words and presented Princess Valara with a crown from his own collection. And on the journey home, Valara found Cole in the observation lounge again, watching the stars stream past the windows. "I have filed 17 requests for information about the Graviton Hammer," she said as she sat down beside him. "Earth Unified Command has denied all of them. They are private about some things," Cole said. "Why did you really accept this assignment?" Valara asked. The truth this time. Cole was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned to look at her with those brown eyes that she had once thought were unremarkable. "Humans have been in the galactic community for 60 years, he said. "In that time, we have been underestimated and dismissed and occasionally laughed at. And everyone assumes that because we are small and fragile and cannot see ultraviolet light, we must be useless." He smiled slightly. "But we are also very stubborn. And we have learned that sometimes the best way to protect someone is to let everyone think you are useless, right up until the moment when you are not." Valara considered this, and she thought about everything she had assumed about humans, and she realized that she had been as wrong as the Kathrani Emperor. "Ambassador Bennett," she said, and she used his full title with a respect she had never felt before. "I believe this is the beginning of a very interesting alliance. I will try not to disappoint. Your Highness." This time, she believed him. The end.